Hello. For today's talk, I thought we could talk about corona conspiracy theories and World War I spies, fighting an infodemic. In mid-February 2020, referring to fake news that spreads faster and more easily than this virus, the Director General of the World Health Organization told a gathering of foreign policy and security experts in Germany, "We're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic." Although the word has been used earlier in the 21st century, it sums up the information overload which is defining COVID-19. Conspiracy theories abound, some marginally more plausible than others. But what is more worrying is how they have spread across the internet, even by those who should, in theory, know better than attempt to spread misinformation. Some celebrities, not to mention political leaders, are sharing their pet theories on multiple platforms, and the rumour factory, ranging from COVID being a biological weapon internationally developed and imported into another country, a virus made in a laboratory, or even spread by 5G masts, have hit the airways and received millions of likes, retweets, and thumbs up. Despite our world being supposedly an open one, it seems that in times of great uncertainty, we start to wonder what is going on behind other nations' closed doors. Are they out to get us or destroy us in some way? We thirst for knowledge and find it where we can. During wartime, of course, there is a similar thirst for knowledge. All combatants seek to discover what their enemies are up to. Spying is as old as warfare itself, and seemingly innocent-looking men and women can be used to acquire and share information with governments desperate for insider information, sometimes acting right under the enemy's noses. Part 1. Unravelling information. You may remember that in the last Corona talk, I briefly mentioned women who used their knitting to pass on information, and I promised to add to their stories. Knitting, as a means of intelligence gathering, was not spawned by the Great War. Molly Rinker lived in Philadelphia during what we, on this side of the Atlantic, call the American War of Independence. For 6 weeks from October 1776, General Washington was camped just a few miles away from her and her husband's inn. A number of, in the Rinkers' eyes, enemy British officers were billeted on them. Molly, as a mere woman, was ordered to wait upon the unwelcome guests. Keeping her eyes and ears open, when she had something useful to pass on, gathering up her knitting, she went and sat on top of a huge rock overlooking a road near Washington's encampment. It would have cost her life if anyone had even suspected that her wool was less innocent than it looked. Scraps of paper containing information were hidden in these balls of wool. Dropped off the rock, the balls were picked up by one of General Washington's dispatch riders. Her reward? To have the rock named after her, although sadly, the statue on the top of the rock is of William Penn, not of courageous Molly. Let's fast forward now some 130 years to the Great War knitters. A few years before war broke out, the UK had established the Secret Intelligence Service, more commonly known as MI6, specifically to gather intelligence from abroad. The desire to know what other states are up to was nothing new, but MI6 brought a level of sophistication to intelligence gathering. I said sophistication, but some techniques were purposefully so seemingly unsophisticated that those who used them were hidden in plain sight. What, in that day and age, could be more innocuous than women knitting? In 1914, Germany occupied most of Belgium. Intelligence about troop movements via Belgium's railway network was desperately needed. Suddenly, rooms with the most desirable views were ones overlooking railway marshalling yards. Buried in MI6 files is information about Belgian knitters who sat quietly knitting as the trains went by. Is that a troop train? Drop a stitch. An artillery one? Purl one. Then back to the pattern till another train passes. Northern France was also occupied. Enter Madame Levendre. Perhaps not too dissimilar from today's lockdown children. Youngsters in occupied areas often could not attend school. Many mothers tried a bit of homeschooling. With her house conveniently overlooking a railway yard, an innocently knitting Madame Levangle would watch troop movements from the upstairs window and tap her feet on the floor to send codes to her children, industriously doing their schoolwork on the floor below. The children would write down the codes, which would be covertly collected by Levangle's handlers. A bit like today's conspiracy theories, with some even more outlandish than others, stories about spies and their antics circulated, were repeated and enlarged upon at each retelling. British citizens were convinced that Germany had poured spies into the country, and anyone with a German-sounding name was suspect. Such convictions were tapping into a genre that had become popular pre-war. Erskine Childer's 1903 The Riddle of the Sands, predicting a German invasion, had become and remained a runaway bestseller. William Le Quec's more sensationalist novels of the same era also featured outlandish plots and dastardly spies. Funny how those who spy for us are heroic intelligence gatherers, and those who spy against us are seen as the scum of the earth. These types of novels, perhaps not unlike Dean Koontz's 1989 edition of The Eyes of Darkness, to which I'll return, were suddenly seen as accurate predictors of actual events. Conspiracy theories proliferated, some even relating to that ubiquitous knitting. Spy mania suggested that agents based in Great Britain were knitting jumpers for sailors as a means of relaying information about Allied naval preparations. According to the patriotic Pearson's magazine, when the German authorities carefully unravelled these articles, they found the wool thread dotted with many knots. By marking a vertical doorframe with the letters of the alphabet spaced precisely an inch apart, the knots could be deciphered as words. Described as an ingenious cipher, this was probably little more than a paranoid fantasy. There's even a word for such methods of stealing messages: steganography. Part 2. Chemical warfare. One of the numerous COVID-19 fake news conspiracy theories is that the virus was a biological weapon made in a laboratory and intentionally unleashed onto an unsuspecting world. Whilst biological weapons were occasionally used for sabotage during World War I, their development only really got going between the wars. However, a young Belgian woman conscripted as a nurse and working in a German military hospital near Dixmude came face to face with the hideous realities of chemical weapons. Unbeknownst to the Germans, Martha Knockaert had been recruited as a British spy. Like others who nursed so-called enemy casualties, Martha began to experience conflicting loyalties. Despite loathing Imperial Germany for invading her homeland, she empathized with the sufferings of her German patients, realizing that they, too, were simply human beings caught up in the world's madness. She also came to acknowledge the humanitarian consequences of the spying activities in which she was becoming ever more deeply involved. In the early spring of 1915, thanks to the evidence that she and the knitting army were passing on, the local railway station was bombed. She writes, "It was I who was responsible for the hellish scene that was now being enacted. I threw myself on my bed and wept as though my heart was breaking." She describes in unflinching detail how her actions had killed friend and foe alike. "I wandered along an endless street of smoking ruins, where the way was strewn with mangled corpses whose glassy eyeballs watched me accusingly." Perhaps unlike soldiers, who can shield behind the sense of carrying out orders, she recognizes her own culpability in the deaths of unknown soldiers, civilians, and my little German officer friend of the railway transport, who had unwittingly divulged secret information, and as a direct result of my transmission, had left behind him 2 young orphaned daughters. However much she might tell herself, "I was serving my country," there are times when she cannot exonerate herself in her own heart. The German authorities had no reason to suspect her of complicity in the recent raid. Her espionage and her nursing continued. In May 1915, she learnt that she had been awarded the Iron Cross for her services in the field, following the latest development in warfare, the first effective gas attack, which took place on the 22nd of April 1915. She had been working in a field hospital packed with French soldiers, beating and fighting the air for breath, their faces contorted out of all human shape. She had acquired graphic first-hand knowledge of what the strange-shaped cylindrical objects she had seen being stockpiled nearby and reported on contained. Equally disturbing was the revelation that the Germans had no antidote to the chlorine gas, which killed more than 1,100 and injured 7,000 in its first effective appearance as a weapon of war. Attempts were now made to recruit her as a German agent, who would be sent back to the tiny unoccupied part of Belgium. Her refusal to so act proved her undoing. Questions began to be asked about her apparent loyalty, and she fell into a trap set for her. In November 1916, she was arrested. At her trial, the death sentence was passed. Speaking in her defense, the chief medical officer of the military hospital where she worked reminded the judge of the Iron Cross. Her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. So she writes, "I began an unending regime without soul or mercy, but buoyed up with a burning conviction that deliverance would come. It came, finally, in November 1918. Weakened almost beyond recognition, out she and her fellow prisoners streamed, half-crazed men and women, into the arms of the British advance guard." She learnt that on the 8th of November 1918, Sir Douglas Haig had mentioned her in dispatches. In 1919, British Secretary of State for War Winston Churchill commended her gallant and distinguished service in the field, as well as awarding her the War and Victory medals. She was also made a Chevalier of the French Légion d'Honneur and received the Belgian Ordre de Léopold, as well, of course, as the British War and Victory medals, making her the only woman, certainly almost the only combatant, to have been decorated by Germany, France, Belgium, and Great Britain. Part 3. What if? What ifs abound in life, and particularly in times of stress. What if China had informed the WHO sooner about what was happening in Wuhan? What if contacts had been rigorously traced? What if we had locked down sooner? Etc., etc. We might never know the answers to some of these, but there may be a clear answer to the what if relating to our next spy. MI6's need for informers on the ground naturally increased once war was declared. From the beginning, refugees poured into England in the wake of the German invasions of Belgium and northern France. Folkestone was a key entry point, and arrivals were screened both for those who may be hoping to pass undetected and were arriving at the behest of the Imperial German Army, and for those who could be potentially sent back to the occupied territory as spies. In October 1914, those processing the incoming refugees noticed a woman in her 30s who seemed to tick their boxes. Named Louise de Bettigny, she had briefly been governess to Crown Prince Rupert of Bavaria's children, had been invited to teach the children of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he of Sarajevo fame, and she spoke French, German, Czech, Italian, and English. Having declined Franz Ferdinand's invitation, she had returned to France just as the Great War erupted. MI6 wheels turned fast. Once she had been spotted, British spy master Captain Cecil Cameron offered her a salary to work for the British back in occupied France. After much hesitation and some not so gentle pressure, because initially she claimed that spying went against her strong religious principles, she finally agreed. After intensive, sophisticated training in map reading and grid referencing in Folkestone's state-of-the-art spy school, she learnt to write in invisible ink on tissue or rice paper, the latter can be swallowed if needs be, engraving minute letters on spectacle frames, and concealing messages in hems of skirts, as well as in hollowed-out vegetables such as turnips. In February 1915, Louise, with the alias Alice Dubois, returned to now brutally occupied Lille, where she came from. She set up a spy network, aptly codenamed Ramble, as she and the 80 agents she recruited covered hundreds of miles on foot. Her Ramblers were so effective that information, including that knitted into seemingly innocent garments, was collected and transmitted within 24 hours, often by attempting to cross from occupied Belgium into neutral Holland, a journey which became increasingly hazardous because in the spring of 1915, an electrified fence was installed across the entire Belgian-Dutch border. Crossing it proved almost as dangerous as crossing the Berlin Wall half a century later. A rough estimate puts the fatalities of between 2,000 and 3,000 souls being basically lightninged to death. If they are to survive, spies learn from experience, and Louise had a couple of narrow escapes. On one occasion, she had concealed messages in miniature writing under the label of a matchbox, which was confiscated. Wanting to light his pipe, a German policeman helped himself to the whole box. With nerves of steel, Louise smilingly gave it to him. Her British spy masters, noted that her work was splendid. One memo asserted, "I cannot speak too highly of the bravery, devotion and patriotism of this young lady. Her service to the British intelligence is simply invaluable." She was presented to the then head of the British Expeditionary Force, General French, who told her, "We need more like you." Her map drawing skills were second to none. She created a reduced map of the German lines with 2,000 gun positions marked. This was then cemented into the fittings of a courier's spectacles. The German High Command began to call the 40 kilometres where her network operated the Cursed Front, as out of nearly 700 miles of front, this is where they suffered the greatest number of unexpected attacks and aerial bombardments. Louise began passing on information about a massive German attack planned for early 1916 on Verdun. The information was relayed to the French commander. He refused to believe it. How could a mere woman know this? The Battle of Verdun lasted 303 days. The price of pig-headedness, 250,000 dead, their bones overflowing the ossuary. With the Germans becoming increasingly aware of the numbers of spies operating in occupied France and particularly around Lille, Louise was on borrowed time. On the 20th of October 1915, she was stopped by a routine patrol. Despite attempting to swallow 3 incriminating pieces of evidence written on rice paper, she was thrown into St. Gilles prison in Brussels, where Edith Cavell had recently been held, and from where, in 1916, Belgian spy Gabrielle Petit would also face her accusers. Even Louise's captors were impressed by her courage. Almost certainly tortured during months of questioning, she never wavered, saying little and denying everything. Eventually, enough incriminating evidence was gathered, and in March 1916 the trial opened. Only the penalty was in question. The execution of Edith Cavell in October 1915 had sent shockwaves reverberating around the world. Would the Germans repeat the error? The same judge presided over the trial as over Cavell's. He again passed the death sentence. It is impossible to know whether it was the intervention of the neutral Spanish authorities with a plea for clemency, the backfiring of the Cavell execution, or the status of the aristocratic de Bettini family, which led to the sentence being commuted to life imprisonment with forced labour in the notorious Siegburg prison near Cologne. Conditions were amongst the harshest in Germany. Freezing cells, putrid food, and even infectious diseases such as typhus were rife. Several French and Belgian women were held there. When they were forced to work in German munitions factories in direct contravention of the Hague Treaty, which forbids the use of prisoner of war labour in activities detrimental to their own side, Louise led a revolt. Thrown into an unheated cell in solitary confinement, In winter 1917, she developed pneumonia, which turned to pleurisy, and then an abscess on the lung. Offered minimal medical care, Louise died on the 27th of September 1918, 45 days before the victory for which she had given her life. Initially buried in Germany, in February 1920, her body was repatriated, with full military honours provided by the French and British armies. She was buried in her family vault near Lille. On the 13th of November 1927, a monument was unveiled commemorating Louise and the heroic women of the occupied territories. Did General Joffre, who was presiding over the ceremony and whose reputation had been badly damaged due to his slow response to the German build-up at Verdun, did he ask himself, what if Louise's intelligence had been acted upon? Part 4. An infodemic with gaps. Just as we are suffering from an infodemic of conspiracy theories relating to COVID-19, a similar infodemic existed during the Great War. Putting spies into the British newspaper archive for August 1914 to November 1918 returned some 71,000 hits. Yet this coverage of spies, like the archive itself, is far from fully comprehensive. Spies slipped through journalists' nets, or their stories suppressed by censors remained unknown. One was a woman who had a significant impact upon the lives and deaths of countless British and French personnel, yet, up until 2017, her actions remained buried in the unnamed burial pit into which her mortal remains were flung on the 5th of January 1918. Just as MI6 had pre-war been on the lookout for likely informers should war break out, a similar operation had been conducted by the Germans, who were particularly interested in recruiting Swiss residents potentially willing to act on their behalf. Their eyes fell on a woman who, according to police records, was rather bizarrely termed a discreet prostitute. Born Marie-Antoinette Avicot, when she began eking out her existence singing in the grim, cutthroat world of café-concert, she adopted the stage name of Regina Diana. Trialed in Paris, she proved adept at coaxing information out of both high-ranking officers and lowly NCOs. By late 1914, she too was transmitting intelligence relating to troop movements, the composition of various arsenals along the Franco-German border, and the preferred routes for refueling military encampments. In 1915, her handlers decided to send her to Marseille, a port of vital importance to Allied shipping, into which troops from Russia, from Britain's southern hemisphere dominions, poured in, whilst others were shipped out to what could be loosely termed the Mediterranean theatres. Bizarrely, while such information was heavily censored in the press, postcards with images of arriving soldiers were freely available. Marseille was also a key area for French soldiers on leave. Like many ports, it had a deeply seedy reputation, and being a music hall artiste provided Regina with the perfect cover. Once in Marseille, she was ordered to befriend officers and men whose position would give them access to exactly the sort of information Germany was desperate to acquire, relating to troops, equipment, ammunition, guns, cannon, and transportation, not to mention ships, which could be targeted by submarines. Marseille was also an important railhead. Railways would prove crucial to Regina's story. By early 1917, her network of informers extended from Paris to Algiers to Marseille to Geneva, where her mother still lived, and onwards to Zurich and Berlin. Amongst the intelligence she gleaned, both from her own observations and pillow talk at the Grand Hôtel des Princes, where she now lodged courtesy of a generous expense account, the information related to a forthcoming French offensive. To transmit her increasingly valuable information, Regina used codes. Her postcards, often sent in triplicate or even quadruplicate, were written in invisible ink with an innocuous greeting over the top. One series of cards revealed information about the number of troops massing in Marseille, or waiting to be sent to a ridge in northern France, where the authorities were planning what would turn into an engagement with calamitous consequences, the now notorious Chemin des Dames. One of Regina's postcards was covering the 417 kilometres from Marseille to Switzerland on the night mail train. The post wagon was heated by a large wood-burning stove. Postal workers sorted the post in readiness for the train's arrival in Lyon. Letters and postcards were scattered across the main sorting table close to the stove. The temperature was near tropical. So much so that something strange started happening to one card. Phoenix-like, a second message began to appear. This seemingly innocent-looking postcard addressed to Zurich was not what it seemed to be. Once the train arrived in Lyon, the card was handed to the local police station. It was rushed to Paris and the military police for further analysis. To their horror, the coded card was relaying vital intelligence that could have only been gleaned by someone with close contacts with the French military. The authorities decided to play a waiting game. They did not have to wait long. In a one-week period, 4 postcards sent to Switzerland were traced back to a postcard close to Marseille's Grand Hôtel des Princes. These reported that as well as the mustering of over 4,000 British and Canadian troops who were departing for northeastern France, leave for French poilus was becoming ever rarer, an indication that a big push was imminent. Aware of the importance of her intelligence, Regina duplicated, possibly triplicated it, for while some of her postcards were intercepted, others got through. Arrested on the 16th of March as she was preparing to dispatch her 38th postcard, mountains of evidence against her were amassed. Her trial opened in September 1917. 470 items were presented to the military court. Some were deemed so sensitive that the court sat in camera. On the 20th of September 1917, to the surprise of no one, the president of the court pronounced the guilty verdict, followed immediately by the sentence. In accordance with Article 81 of the Military Code, civilian Marie-Antoinette Abicot, alias Regina Diana, was to be executed by firing squad. But the process of law was not yet complete. Justice still had both to be done and to be seen to be done, and the court's findings confirmed. The judgment was dispatched to the military court in Lyon, which duly approved both the findings and the sentence. Now the Paris Court of Appeal had to reach a final decision. Should clemency be extended, or was the case solid, and should the relevant article of the military code be enforced? The 22nd of November 1917 verdict was unambiguous. The case was proven, the appeal for clemency rejected. French President Poincaré had decided justice should take its course and the dread sentence be carried out. As the firing party mustered on Saturday the 5th of January 1918 at 6:30 a.m., crowds also gathered. If the trial were held behind closed doors, not so the execution. The expectant spectators might have wondered why the firing party consisted not of the usual 12 men, but of 25, each with a loaded rifle. The French authorities were determined that nothing would prevent Regina Diana paying the full price for her actions. 12 of the shots fired impacted on the body, 3 on the heart. A nameless, unidentifiable common burial pit awaited the mortal remains of this highly colourful, loud, and enigmatic woman. Researching her story over several years, I still cannot decide if she was a helpless pawn caught up in a game that was too intricate and too complicated, whose rules she did not fully comprehend, or whether she was glorying in her power. She had had to claw her way up from her lowly, impoverished background. Like all agents, she knew the stakes were high, but spying seemed to give her the opportunity to move away from being a café-concert and music hall artiste at the beck and call of pimping managers, and allow her to live, perhaps permanently, at the Grand Hôtel des Princes in Marseille. Regina's story was recently dramatized in Switzerland by a small group of English-speaking singers. If you would like to see her return to her rightful place on the stage and discover more about her colourful, tragic life that I have only really touched on, the link appears on this slide, and it can also be found on my website, www.firstworldwarwomen.co.uk. You may remember my mentioning the initial and ongoing popularity of spy novels. One intriguing thought is that post-war, the former British head of the Secret Intelligence Service in Marseille opened a school, Tennerhof, in Austria. He would certainly have known of Regina's actions and her fate. A future novelist who described Tennerhof as the golden time when the sun always shone was a pupil. Did schoolboy Ian Fleming lap up stories about spies in Marseille? And did this lead him to believe that the spy genre was one he could usefully exploit? If so, perhaps a little like Dean Coote's naming the deadly virus Wuhan 400 in the 1989 edition of The Eyes of Darkness, fact can indeed be stranger than fiction. Thank you for listening to these Corona Talks. Stay safe